everybody. I'm Jerry McHugh Jr., San Juan Resources. Welcome to this month's Improving Our San Juan IQ, and thanks for being here. I know how valuable your time is, so I appreciate you joining in today. Our sponsor for the IQ is Process Equipment and Service Company, or PESCO. So I'm so pleased to have as our guest today, Chris Wright, CEO, founder of Liberty Oilfield Services. Additionally, Chris founded and serves as executive chairman of Liberty Resources, a Bakken-focused E&P and Liberty Midstream Solutions. Chris has had a lifelong passion for energy and its role in the human life. In fact, Chris has a ton of enthusiasm, much more, he's an unbelievable passion for growing this industry and communicating its importance in the U.S. and the world. He has spoken on energy to the UK House of Lords, States Attorneys General, federal and state judges, and debated the merits of the shale revolution on TV, and has given over 100 talks, probably more than that, I imagine. Chris completed an undergrad degree at MIT, graduate work in electrical engineering at both UC Berkeley and MIT. Chris founded Pinnacle Technologies, and from 1992 to 2006 served as CEO. Pinnacle created the hydraulic fracture mapping industry. Pinnacle's innovations in fracturing practices helped launch commercial shale gas production in the late 1990s. Chris grew up in Colorado and is a passionate skier, cyclist, climber, and outdoor enthusiast. So welcome, Chris. I'll just put this challenge out to everyone. You, like I said, you inspire me to put it out there, and I challenge our listeners to also be inspired by your enthusiasm for the business and everything that we're doing. So thank you for joining. And initially, what are your thoughts on this business, the oil and gas in the Rockies, especially with the federal lands? We'll just jump in right away on that.
Jerry, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for joining in. Because this industry, our industry, is the industry that enables every other industry. I mean, we can't build a wind turbine or a solar panel or go to an anti-oil and gas protest without a significant amount of oil and gas, for transportation, for materials, for our quality of life. So, the short term, I say, look, it's not going away just because people say we're going away or it's sunsetting. Of course, that's not going to happen. The question is, what are the ramifications going to be on where oil and gas is produced, what the cost of it might be to consumers, what the cost of it might be to produce. Politicians can affect a lot of those things, but they've never had much success in changing the actual balance of where people get energy from. And Jerry, before I talk about federal lands, a quick update on just the latest data, right? The United States Energy Information Administration releases monthly reports. They release annual reports, and they cover not just the US, but globally. Basically, where is energy being produced and where is energy being consumed? And I had two interesting things in the last couple of years that you may not have heard about. And number one is the percent of energy consumed in the United States, so independent of production, but the percent of energy we consume in the United States from oil and gas is all-time high in the market share. People think our industry is about to go away. Is the highest percent of energy the United States has gotten from oil and gas, two highest years ever, 2019, 2020. Just under 70% of the total energy consumed in the United States comes from oil or natural gas liquids. So that doesn't sound like a shrinking, dying industry for me. I think everyone already knows record production ever for oil, natural gas liquids also happened right before COVID. And I think we'll see that again. Certainly in natural gas, we'll see that. Oil, we'll see whether we hit that same high again or not. We certainly could. I think economics and investment decisions will decide whether we do or not. The federal lands thing, and look, I'm particularly passionate or concerned about the San Juan Basin because it is so dependent on the federal government, as is Wyoming and as is a good part of the New Mexico Permian Basin. The federal government suspended federal permits for that 90 days, very visibly, politically on Biden's inauguration. He's messaging there. Yeah, in theory, that message is I'm fighting climate change. But stopping permits on federal land doesn't do anything for climate change except make greenhouse gases and pollutants slightly worse, because that doesn't change the consumption of oil and gas. It just means it's not going to be produced in the cleaner fashion we do it on federal land. It's going to come from somewhere else. But you'll notice permits started to flow again at a low level, but permits are being issued again after that 90-day period. And so, look, there's a lot of political posturing and gambling going on. I don't know how this politically unfolds. I think the San Juan Basin was an emerging new play. I think quite an exciting play with a few great companies down there. Liberty's still been fracking down there this year. We're still committed to seeing that basin happen. But the pace at which that basin might unfold really comes down to permitting. And Jerry, you and so many other people on the call are closer and more intimately involved in that from me than I am. And I'd love to hear about that. But the resources are there. The demand is there. It's just permitting.
Right. Well, I think I looked the acting field district manager in the eye, and he said, we have rights to permit. We're not going to slow those down. We're trying to get things done. What we see, though, is a government ineptitude. It's almost like it's a planned ineptitude of the computer systems failing, things like that, where things just aren't as streamlined as we're. And they had problems before President Biden came in. They tried to fix a lot of things. In fact, the resource management plan, because of COVID, was delayed and essentially stopped in its tracks. You know, they were unable to have Zoom meetings in New Mexico because of that. The people said they can't pass the RMP. So anyways, that's a big hole in the San Juan Basin.
I saw your show on that with an official from the DOE. I watched the San Juan IQ and heard all about that. Yeah, it's unfortunate that didn't get done in time.
Yeah, that was DOI, and so anyways, it's been a tough road there. So yeah, the Rockies. I mean, everyone loves the San Juan Basin. It's considered a top 2-tier basin in the country. We'll have 100 years in October of commercial production. Just an amazing asset. I mean, I think our best days are ahead of us, and I think we'll probably produce more in the next 100 years than we did the last 100 years, and with fewer wells. There will be less surface damage, and there'll be much more production in that area, especially with the horizontal oil that you see in the south. You know, they only had 448 million barrels produced in the first 100 years, and I think we'll probably far surpass that in the next 100 years. 54 trillion cubic feet of gas produced in the first 100 years. So majors have caved on climate emissions, fossil fuels. It seems like they're going to be the new green companies. They're told by their shareholders to abandon oil and gas, carbon sequestration. Let's get down to zero emissions. What's your view on this, Chris, when you see what's going on out there?
So in my original company, Pinnacle, probably about 20 years ago, we got into the carbon sequestration business. No one heard about it then, but since we had these technologies for mapping the motion of fluid underground, one of the applications was that this is the national labs doing this in test. But if we inject CO2 underground, are we sure it's going to stay there? Is it going to create fractures or find faults and flow up to the surface and vent? So I started to look at that as a business 20 years ago. And that drove me to say, hey, if this is going to be a growing business line for us, I want to understand what are the long-term prospects of this. And so I decided to dig deeply into climate change. What's the chemistry? What's the physics? What's the data? How do the models work? What are the biggest unknown variables? And so I've been speaking on climate change, giving public talks or debates, although the advocates of the alarmism cause rarely ever will debate. And if you dig into the data, you'll see why. So it's a real issue. And I think, certainly we've hurt ourselves sometimes in not talking about it, in either dismissing it as wrong or just, today, just not engaging in it. All right, we're being beat up. Or, all right, the world wants us to lower our greenhouse gas emissions. here's the SASB guidelines, and we're going to check the boxes about how we replaced this tiny little generator here with this other thing that's twice as expensive and less reliable, but it reduces, 2 pounds of CO2 emissions. So we've, I think, a little bit too much just adopted that scorecard as the central scorecard. Not that it's not complete, not that it's not relevant at all. The point is, as far as making human lives better, it's not very relevant. So one of the things our company, Liberty, has been working on, and we will release, I think, the very end of next week. Think Memorial Day weekend, either the Friday before or immediately after Memorial Day weekend. We have produced about a 75-page report, our first, what would be called ESG report. We call it Bettering Human Lives. That's the goal. That's the mission at Liberty. How can we better people's lives? And obviously, cleaner air is part of that, more energy, more opportunities, better health, longer lives. Think of all the things that matter to you. That's the goal, I think, broader goal, I would say, of our industry, and it's certainly the specific goal of Liberty. But in bettering human lives, I went through a ton of data to try to decide what are the big energy challenges in the world. And I think there's 3. Number 1, by far and away, is energy poverty. Over 2 million people die every year simply because they cook their food burning wood, dung, or agricultural waste, just like all of our ancestors did. That's still a third of humanity. The replacement fuel, almost everybody that moves from that, I've traveled around the world and been in a bunch of these huts and places, and they're humans just like us. In fact, they're tough and resilient, but this is what they've got available to cook their daily meals. The transition fuel is propane, or liquid petroleum gas, as it's marketed, overseas. 85% of the people in Tanzania are with traditional fuels. 6 companies now are selling and distributing LPG around. Now, how can they do that? The United States has quadrupled our propane exports. We're by far and away the largest of exporter in propane and natural gas liquids in general. So this does 2 great things. Massively increases the availability of the fuel, and it's pushed the price down that allows people to transition and go there. That same third of humanity, we've got a little less than 1 billion people with no access to electricity, another billion with only a few hours a day of low wattage electricity. That's way better than no electricity, but that's not enough electricity to power up groundwater pump to truly change the economic outcome for people. So in broad brush, a third of humanity suffers from dire energy poverty. They need electricity. They need clean burning fuels. We produce those fuels. So that motivates me. That drives Liberty. I think it's the most important thing our industry does. The second global energy challenge, also a big deal and also critical and maybe more obvious to everyone, is just affordable, reliable energy, clean energy. When people in Texas couldn't turn their light switch on and the lights didn't go on, 200 people froze to death. So in California, where I lived for a long time, electricity is becoming increasingly more expensive and increasingly less reliable. How can, the communications technology is getting better, TVs, everything's getting better, but our electricity grid in the United States and in Europe is actually getting worse, less reliable, more expensive. This is a major challenge. And again, it's a bigger challenge for lower or moderate income people, not necessarily dirt poor people, but blue collar people, the people who are the spirit of our industry. They tend to work in energy intensive industries. California, through its magical social policies, has managed to create the highest adjusted poverty rate in the nation. So if you make energy expensive, you make property expensive, you hurt people. People that already own stuff, well, it got more valuable. Rich people and politicians and business people who deal on Zoom calls, they often lose sight of who the majority of people in the world are. And so this is energy challenge number 2. Energy challenge number 3 is climate change, but it's massively slower moving, massively smaller impact. And by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's own economics, at the rate we're warming right now, we got pretty good data on this for 40 years from satellite data, around the year 2080. So I know that's top on Jerry's calendar today, is planned for 2080, but around the year 2080, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's math, if we don't do anything about climate change and we get to this 2 degrees C warming above background levels that we should see around then, it's going to reduce global per capita income somewhere between 0.2% and 2%. So massively smaller impact than a recession over the next 60 years. So now that's a negative reduction. It's not nothing. It may be worse than that. It may actually still be a net positive in 2080. We don't know. But what we do know is it's very slow moving, relatively modest, does not rank up there with millions of people dying every year because they don't have clean cooking fuel. And look, in the long run, which country has declined their greenhouse gas emissions the most? By far, the United States, the one that didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, the one that never really moved into the Paris Accords. We're rejoining now, but we haven't done much for that at all. So our decline in emissions came from just good old-fashioned marketplaces and technology, and dominantly from the shale revolution. But the decarbonization of fuel sources has been going on for about 200 years. Transition from wood to coal, meaningfully higher energy density, lower carbon intensity. Coal to oil, to natural gas, to nuclear. This is the trend economically that was happening already in society. And the sort of government interventions and top-down mandates haven't meaningfully impacted that.
Okay, you talked about the ramifications that we're having, and energy poverty was really at the top of my list as well. I mean, I think of domestic energy poverty and just the hurt it's putting on folks, mainly in California. I mean, it's kind of they're kind of the bellwether. Whatever starts happening there is going to happen around the country, only because they've taken these strict policies, which, and they're predicting blackouts this summer and things like that. Do you see any sort of, are people getting any sort of, is it resonating with anybody that there's this energy poverty out here in the United States?
Jerry, I think we're way early on in that, but I do think you're going to hear a lot more about that in the coming 4 years. And the reason is the actions we're going to take, they're not meaningfully going to change the demand for oil and gas, but they are, and have so far, hurt a little bit the production of oil and gas. So as oil and gas prices get higher, then people talk about it more. I don't think they're going to race up immediately, but look at what happened with the Colonial Pipeline shutdown, right? A cyber attack and, in theory, a ransomware thing. All of a sudden, we delayed bringing gasoline to the southeast coast, and that got people's attention. I'm sure you saw the just horrifying fist fights at gas stations with people trying to wait in line to fill up the gas in their car. So when you provide an absolutely essential service like we do in this industry, people take us for granted, and they tend to be a little bit of resentment. But then when that security is threatened or the price goes up, then there's a dramatic increase in appreciation for our industry. Think of the irony. Biden's first day in office, and he cancels the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline from our closest and biggest trading partner, Canada. He cancels that immediately, a new pipeline. And now 3 or 4 months into his presidency, and one of his challenges is one pipeline was shut down for 1 week, and people were upset. People are concerned. He's worried about, is he the Jimmy Carter? That energy infrastructure, people take it for granted until it's threatened, until it's not there. There certainly is a growing movement in California. There's a fantastic congressman in California who's a Democrat, longtime member of the California legislature. He's adamantly against these policies to move energy more expensive and less reliable. He's going to catch some traction. Robert Bryce, a great writer in Austin, Texas, is writing more and more about this. But as it hits people's pocketbooks, I think we're going to see more focus on this issue. Also, when Trump was president, right, people, half the country or more hated Trump, right? So whatever Trump was for, they were automatically against. So I think that increased the intensity of opposition to our industry. Now we got that. We got a Biden administration that's going to be all about shutting down, hurting our industry, and talking about climate change, but no real answers about what's the benefit to people or the country by spending trillions of dollars and not meaningfully moving our energy mix. I think this swing so far the other way is going to bring some sobriety back into that dialogue. I'm seeing it already.
Well, it seems like things are going to have to change, and the narratives that we hear so much about how if we don't pass this bill by next week, the planet's going to burn up, next summer. I mean, these threats are just so outlandish, and the amount of money we have to pay. I know we're speaking to the choir. The amount of money we have to pay and the infinitesimal benefits of these things is just incredible. Has anybody done much cost analysis of this? What you never, of course, a lot of things we read in the papers that come to the door, we don't get that. Even the Wall Street Journals seems like they've jumped on the climate emergency bandwagon, it's called now, not climate change.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, this is going to force an engagement. There was a great exchange. Someone just sent me a little link. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana was talking to one of the administrators in Biden's administration and asking him just that question, Jerry. What's the cost of what you're doing and what's the actual benefit? And he was asking the benefit probably even in the right term, which is if we pass this $2 trillion infrastructure package, a third of it's focused on climate change, what's the reduction in temperatures going to be from that bill? We're going to spend a lot of money, and in theory, it's to fight a big problem. What's that benefit? And of course, the administrator never answered the question, but he kept pushing it. And I can give you a simple answer. If we achieved Biden's goals completely, and there's almost zero chance of that, we drop US greenhouse gas emissions, and they base it from 2005 levels. But if we drop that 50% by 2030 and go to net zero by 2050, and then remain at net zero for the next 50 years, all the way to the year 2100, if you take that amount of greenhouse gas reduction and you run it into the United Nations sort of consensus, it's really a composite climate model from all the other models, the answer might surprise you. If we did all of that, the cost of that is in the tens of trillions. In the year 2100, according to these models, I think they actually overestimate the warming we're likely to see, since they've overestimated it for the last 40 years. Probably they're overestimating going forward as well. But you put all that in, the Earth in the year 2100 would be 7/100ths of 1 degree cooler than it would be without it. Way below our measurement threshold and ability to characterize sort of the global average temperature. So tens, maybe $100 trillion for 7/100ths of a degree reduction in temperature 80 years from now, 3 generations from now. Think of the world 3 generations ago. At just even a modest pace of economic growth rate, the well-being, the safety, the energy empowerment of today is just dramatically better than 3 generations ago. World's likely going to be dramatically wealthier 3 generations from now, and we'll have impoverished people today, ramped up the number of people on an annual basis that die because we made energy more expensive for an absolutely immeasurably small benefit. Because forcing change, the problem of wind and solar is they take a lot of land, they take a lot of materials, and they're intermittent. So you got to have a whole separate power system to back up this new power system. That's just almost no chance that's going to pass a cost benefit analysis. But is nuclear power going to come? Is the ability to sequester carbon from a modern natural gas plant that burns in supersaturated oxygen and CO2 atmosphere and just inject that thing straight from a plant underground? Very possibly. Like, we can make economic progress towards reducing CO2 emissions, but top-down mandates and subsidies for technologies that don't really have the prospect to carry the load, I think is hugely human destructive. Sorry, I'm rambling too much.
Oh, Jerry. No, are the Western nations and the US in particular, we seem to be paying a heavy price for all these models that everyone's trying to, put ourselves into. I mean, I remember the commercial growing up. It's not nice to fool with Mother Nature. And I'm not sure this, we might as well just throw money out the window because I'm not sure the benefits are even there.
And Jerry, I think it's happening, of course, for political reasons. Like I engage with a lot of politics here in Colorado and nationally. And the amazing thing is most of them know almost nothing about climate change. They haven't clicked, a few strokes on Google to look at the temperature data or the sea ice data or the hurricane data. That data is easily accessible. In fact, if you Google Chris Wright climate change, you can watch an hour-long, very nerdy talk going through it all. And our report that'll come out in 2 weeks, I'll have a little bit shorter summary, I think with 13 graphs in there to kind of communicate it. But the people that are passing these policies, they've never invested that effort even to learn that, because they don't appear to be driven really by concerns about climate change. It's that the youth today in so much of the country is so worried about climate change that it brings political power. We can do what we wanted to do anyway, or something over here, and we can justify it in climate change, and we'll get the support of the majority of the people. So that, of course, the problem comes in education. When I engage with people, anybody 35 or younger, they've been brought up that this is an impending catastrophe. And in their schools, they talk about these sort of scary narratives, but they don't engage in the math, the physics, and look at the data. I have two big other concerns about the climate change exaggeration. And one is we're making science less appealing. Kids today, and I speak in high schools, I speak in universities, there's less interest in going to study science, because if you hear science thrown around by politicians, follow the science. It's like this authoritative top-down diktat. That's not what science is about, and that's not intriguing to kids. If science, when I was young, was this quest for adventure to understand, how does a black hole form? Are there black holes? What's a supernova? Super fascinating stuff. Science is this quest to understand, this quest to adventure that pulled people into science. Today, we're actually pushing people away from science. That has long-term negative benefits as well. And the other one I'll throw out real quick, Jerry, is we're scaring people. Something like 25% of kids under 20, express anxiety about climate change, that their future is going to be clipped short, they're not going to die of old age, or they're going to live in a scarier, more frightening world. And the biggest one there, and then I'll shut up, you hear ceaselessly on our media, on the news, from politicians of both sides, that storms are getting more frequent, droughts are greater, hurricanes are worse, tornadoes are out of control, superstorms are soon to take us down. Even in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the bureaucracy set up to promote climate change as an issue, they don't make these claims because the data is very clear. There's not, in 100 years, there's no increasing trend in hurricanes. Drought is actually slowly going down. Flood damage, it's hard to do just floods, is actually going down as a percent of the economy. Deaths from extreme weather have declined over 95% in the last century. Corrected for population, it's over 98%. So all the things kids are so worried about, none of them are actually happening. Right. Sea levels are rising, but they have been for 150 years. They're rising about a little more than an inch a decade today. If that continued for centuries more, it would be actually quite a modest issue, not a non-issue, but relatively modest compared to the other challenges the world faces.
Well, we need to talk about the facts and not the narratives that are out there on the morning paper and the television and things like that, because the facts will really show how things are, and that this is a huge exaggeration. We had a question someone submitted about pricing, and this has a little bit to do with the policies that are out there. This company's thesis, their Rocky Mountain producer, they say that for future pricing, very generally, their thesis is that climate change policy will destroy oil and gas supply faster than it will destroy demand. Supply destruction will have many forms, from overt, like frack bans and permitting bans, to subtle constraints like capital constraints, which accelerate decline rates. Demand is deeply embedded and difficult to reduce economically. The result, we believe, is that prices will remain economic, 15% return on capital, or even robust over the longer term. So this writer was wondering what you anticipate in the context of the escalating and changing policy headwinds.
And I would say, look, I've had a similar perspective for some time. I compare, and I think it's mostly been returns on capital and availability of capital more than policy so far. Policy probably adds on to these same impacts, but I compared the shale revolution to the dot-com revolution. My original company was 7th and Townsend, south of Market in San Francisco, literally the block that was dot-com central of where that thing took off. The internet was this enormously transformative technology, and everybody wanted to invest in it. So there was an absolute flood of capital, mostly venture capital, but follow-on equity rounds, even a huge amount of this crazy debt that came into startup internet companies. People were right that the internet was going to be a big deal, but there was so much of a herd mentality, so much money came in, and it was destroyed. 90% of these companies bankrupt and gone. But it wasn't because the internet wasn't a big deal. It was because malinvestment, overinvestment, too many companies. Shale revolution, I think, is the same story. The shale revolution just completely changed global energy, oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids supply and demand. We had oil that averaged just under $100 for 6 or 7 years. And the last 5 or 6 years, it's averaged about $50. Huge reset lower in oil prices. Great for the citizens of the world, but disruptive for the businesses. So if you look back the last decade, our industry return on capital has been awful. And so the main reason I think that divestment campaigns and people pulling out of oil and gas, I think the biggest reason is the returns have been terrible. Now, and part of it, of course, it's politically unpopular, but it's easy to jump on a politically correct bandwagon and virtue signal if it also makes sense financially for investments. So we've had sort of both of those factors the last 5 or 10 years. Now we've got much less capital going in our industry. The number of companies is shrinking. The amount of money being invested in the ground is shrinking. So now we're bringing into balance slower growth in supply. Even people with great drilling economics are more cautious, more disciplined in the way they're investing that capital. What does that lead to? Better returns on capital. Fewer companies, stronger companies, better returns on capital. And there are a number of big, large brand name investment funds that hold this same premise. They've started to move into investing in oil and gas. I think you'll see more people coming back. Investing meaning buying the equities, not new capital, but coming in and saying, hey, this sector is structurally righting itself. And yes, so a long answer, but yes, I think the next 5 or 10 years actually will probably be reasonably good for our industry because relative to production costs, I think we'll have a little bit higher natural gas and oil prices. Oil prices, you already see it today. Natural gas prices now are over $3. And for most areas today, pretty strong returns at that. And I don't think great prospects for oil. Oil's not likely to go back down to $40 or gas to $2 for extended periods of time. Certainly disruptions can do that. But yes, I think the price outlook in the next 5, 10, 20 years is probably biased as positive.
You think demand is going to hang in there pretty well for the U.S., mainly in Western Europe and at least our world of Western societies? And it's probably COVID question too, I think, too, COVID recovery.
Yeah, I don't get, BP came out, I think like 2 months into COVID, that the world is likely seeing peak oil demand. COVID's going to reset the world and we're going to come back differently. And oh my gosh, I just roll my eyes when I hear this. I think we will see next year, 2022, will likely be peak oil demand, or not peak, highest demand for oil ever. And I think you'll see a continued growth going forward. It depends on the price. If the price of oil is $100, demand may be flattish. If the price of oil is $50 or $60, I think we'll see, 500,000 or so barrels of new demand per year. And that new demand mostly comes from people rising out of poverty or, low income people rising to moderate income people. So look, most people in India don't have a car. Most people in China don't have a car. So as people's lives get better and their incomes rise, demand for oil and natural gas grows. So most of that demand is overseas. Like US, the increasing demand for natural gas in the US right now is both power production displacing coal, but I mean, we've gotten to 40% of the power stack. That may go higher, but here it probably creeps higher. I think the biggest growth in demand for natural gas in the US is going to be increasing exports, because world demand for natural gas looks quite good in almost any scenario. If we go all in and they're going to spend these tens of trillions of dollars building wind and solar all around the world, that means we need more natural gas to firm the power. Coal and nuclear are not great sources. They can't switch their power output fast enough to firm intermittent sources very well. So yeah, I think the global outlook for demand of natural gas is quite good in almost all scenarios. Oil demand, I suspect, grows for probably at least another decade or two. And the magnitude of that growth, I think, is mostly tied to the price of oil. The oil demand has not grown in Europe or the US or Japan for 2 decades. In fact, it's slowly declined in Europe and Japan. With taxes, they've made oil very expensive, and therefore they've cut back a little bit demand for oil. Japan's got a demographic issue. It's just an aging population, so their structural demand for oil is going down. But the growth in demand for oil and natural gas is coming from the rest of the world. But the wealthy countries, that's an order of 1 billion people. The planet has 7.5 billion people. So it's not like a few others we're counting on. It's the other 6.5 billion that are driving the growth in demand.
Do you see in the U.S. You talk about natural gas filling the void with the renewables? I mean, logistically, are we set up? I mean, we haven't been set up in California to do that from the blackouts last summer. We weren't set up to do that in Texas this past winter. Will that change, that we logistically have those natural gas backup power that we should depend upon? Is that going to be baked into the regulations, the states?
No, Jerry, I think all those problems get worse before they get better. But it's by getting meaningfully worse that you'll probably see a switch there. But that switch is it's probably 5 or 10 years. New York State, they just shut down the giant nuclear power plant that's 30% of the electricity for Manhattan, for New York City. And so, no, people are doing these things and the costs are hidden or buried. And as long as they can keep doing them and get political points for doing them, they will. But when the costs and grid instability and rising electricity prices offset that factor, then you'll see sobriety return. But I think that's a ways away. California is a very interesting question. California is so completely run by wealthy people that sort of, middle income people and lower income people are not a major political force in California. California is the largest importer of electricity of any state. So yes, they've gone to, much more solar power in California, but they just they import hydropower from the Northwest. They import power from Arizona, from coal or whatever. Yeah, they haven't meaningfully moved their greenhouse gas emissions, a little bit, but not much, and more expensive reliability problems. Yeah, yes, that pushback, Jerry, that swing back will come, but we may see some of it in the next few years, but it may be 5 or 10 years from now.
Okay, let's pivot to the San Juan. You've got the lion's share of the production down there. There's a bunch of new operators down there, about 5 or 6 of them down there. I talked with Logos yesterday on our map here. Logos is in red. They just drilled down here in the southern part, got two wells done, and they're going to be fracking this coming up. And they moved up to the Rosa, to the northern part, to drill a couple horizontal 2-mile laterals up there. They anticipate large reserves coming out of those wells. We've also got the EOG down here on the south. They have been working on this project for the last 4 or 5 years, bought a lot of these federal leases that came up for sale, and put together this project down there. EOG has built the bullet pad. It's ready to go. Production equipment. is on there. Flare stack. They're waiting on a gas line hookup facilities there. There's a little video of it. It's a humongous pad just south of 550. So they have some issues of getting out there on that. And then we've got DJR Energy. If we go back to the map, they're in green. They bought the Elm Ridge and the Encana properties. They're the green company in the southern part, mostly southern. They've completed 8 ducts this year and are going to resume drilling later in the spring. And then of course Red Willow, we don't have them on the map up here. They're in Colorado and drill a bunch of fruitland wells. That's what the drilling is going on. We also have ICAV, who bought out the BP asset. They produce 660 million a day. And about 2 months ago, we had the CEO on, Bobby Sadati, talking about them. You know, you talked a little bit about the San Juan, the impressions, thoughts. You know, Liberty down there. Any other thing you can say on the San Juan, Chris?
So look, you know, though we're a little bit bigger company now, we still have the mentality of small, scrappy entrepreneurs. That's the idea when we started Liberty, and that culture hasn't changed. So we talked to a number of the players you just mentioned, you know, in the San Juan Basin, asking about Liberty going down there, maybe just 2 years or so, 2 or 3 years ago. We loved it. New technical challenge, new basin. One of the other things I love about our oil and gas industry is who's had it the worst the last 30 or 40 years? Rural America, right? The money, the political power has gone to cities, and incomes and you know, healthcare systems and stuff has struggled in rural America. Our industry is a bringer of money and jobs and people to rural areas. So I loved sort of this idea of the San Juan Basin, as long as the rocks work, but the rocks do. I think the geology's there, the resources there, the companies, the commitment was there. So we pretty quickly jumped in. You know, we rented a facility, we moved it, a number of people down there. We set up frac operations. It looked like we would have had, you know, 1 to 2 frac spreads fully booked and going. So small basin, you know, people say, well, why wouldn't you just put 2 spreads in the Permian? You know, that's certainly 2 more spreads in the Permian. We obviously have lots there. That's certainly easier. But we want to work in the different challenges as well. So we love the San Juan Basin. We love the companies there. So Liberty dove in, and I think we'd have a very exciting story to tell today, if not for a few things. COVID hammered prices. So it disrupted activity just as it was really ramping up. And as you talked about, the sort of getting the broader plans approval and getting getting permitting to build years-long runway of stuff. It not quite happened. And now an election, and change of administration, change of the Department of Interior has disrupted a lot of that. The companies, the rocks, now the economics, the prices are back again for oil and natural gas. So we are emotionally and physically still committed. We want to see the San Juan Basin happen. We're going to do what we can to help on the technical side, on the support side. But I think the biggest challenge today is getting permits and development plans approved. And that's something, is done by the E&P companies and not done by the service companies. So I'm more a watcher, a cheerleader of that, but certainly in touch with all the companies you talked about. And I hope that by later this year and certainly in next year, we see activity going along at a pretty good clip in the San Juan Basin again. Permits pending, it's certainly possible. And I hope it is.
Well, and I think from our map, EOG has 57 permits that are ready to go. They can't get a pipeline in there to move their gas out of their bullet pad. So they're at the behest of right away and different kinds of surface to get out of there. DJR and Enduring have a large number of permits, over 100 and 150 in some cases. Of course, they have 13,000 a day for DJR and 17,000 a day for Enduring of production. So that's some good barrels. Recently, this past week, I think the state was shocked with the new methane rules, which came out from the state of New Mexico. We've had some independents on a panel working on a working group for a year, and stripper wells and all those are going to be off the table. And they said, no, they're going to be under the same the same test that a large well is going to be under. So 98% of the methane has to be, you cannot have any leaks coming off the well based on that. So it's I think the compliance and the regulatory business is huge. I don't know if you know about that, but the state has really clamped down. I talk about ramifications and those sorts of things. It's a huge challenge. I applaud you for putting some frac spreads down there, for having the foresight. Of course, we've had this 1 year, 5-month pause button with COVID, shutting everything down. And so, the San Juan is a great spot. It's in the middle of the country. Access is good to California, to Texas, to the Costa Azul plant in Mexico. Next month, we'll have Western States and Tribal Nations Gas Chair Initiative guy, Jason Sandell, on, so he'll talk about that. But I think we're in a great space, and of course, obviously price is key. If it can stay above $3, then there can be that demand. Some have predicted that we're losing deliverability just because we're drilling less. So, some of us are starting to see that. So,
Jerry, one of the biggest hurdles you mentioned, is this capture regulations on methane. And I do think that, certainly in this first Biden term, I think that's going to be the biggest regulatory issue across our industry, is going to be methane capture, prevent venting and reduce flaring and move methane. And of course, our industry in big picture loves that idea, wants to do it. I wish we'd done it a little bit faster, but think, what does it take to do that? It takes the ability to build infrastructure. See EOG, it's not that they don't want to build a pipeline, they're having struggle. You need to be able to build gathering lines and takeaway capacity, and to invest in all that infrastructure, you need some certainty. You can't build infrastructure for the next 20 years, but know that you might be shut down in a year or two. So the administration wants to, your stated goals are to reduce flaring and venting. Those, we could say, admirable goals, but we need to get from the same administration the kind of things that enable that to happen, which is the ability to build infrastructure and the ability to have some certainty going forward in a development plan. So hopefully those come together. Otherwise, we have, as you pointed out right at the start, is we have sort of inconsistent goals. We want to reduce flaring and methane, but we don't want to give any certainty. So we need people to build infrastructure, but we're making it hard to build infrastructure, and we're making more uncertainty, which is a dissuasion from building infrastructure. I want to see the infrastructure built and some certainty in the development, and a huge economic benefit to the Four Corners community and San Juan Basin. And it benefits not just the local community in jobs and tax revenues and all that, but it's just more diversity and energy source. I always say, what's the biggest source of smog in California, in the Western United States? It's blown in pollution from Asia, right? What's the biggest thing we can do to clean Western air is to get more LNG to China and Southeast Asia, so we can displace more coal and more industrial use of coal with industrial use of natural gas. It's actually an air cleaning program to grow more natural gas production out of the Piceance and the San Juan Basin. I've made that argument to our politicians, and they don't necessarily even have any arguments to disagree with it. They say voters want action on climate change. Well, why? Do they want dirtier air and poorer people?
Well, the gain is minuscule compared to the cost. And having grown up here in Denver in the 70s, we would drive through the city and you couldn't even see the mountains. The smog was so thick. So we've made humongous strides. People don't, they take for granted that was where we are now, but it's quite incredible where we are now.
That picture is in our report. Well, we have two of those.
Okay.
We have a Pittsburgh before and after, and we have a Colorado picture from the 1970s. and it's from I-25 in the same picture from today. And you can see we have a little DJ Basin case study. You know, oil and gas production have gone up 5-fold. Emissions and air quality have continued to improve throughout it all.
Okay, well, I challenge everyone to get out, get into advocating for this industry like Chris has done. If you have half the enthusiasm as Chris Wright, then you'll be great. Now look at me, I'm a card-carrying introvert, and I'm out here talking up the amazing San Juan Basin. So I encourage you guys to try, all you guys and gals to try it too. One letter to the editor, one dialogue, not an argument. I think it's important that we have dialogue. Dialogue with a friend. Go ahead.
No, I totally agree, Jerry. It's those dialogues across the fence at neighborhood barbecues, friendly, not argumentative, but just engaging with people. That's what it's going to take, and particularly with the young. But it takes time. But absolutely, it's from everybody. It's not this will not work top down message from a few people. This is from everyone. And so, Jerry, I've loved what you've done. I've learned a lot listening to the San Juan Basin IQs. You've got a great guests and all that. And I think it's great what you're doing. Exactly.
Oh,
you're doing exactly what we need. Engaging more people in the dialogue.
Well, I encourage everyone out there who's on the IQ today to do that. I mean, heck, the Denver Post, they print letters I send to them, and they're very simple and rather dumbed down, but I'll share that next week, because the governor of our state here in Colorado took ourselves off the Western States Tribal Initiative program for gas. That's just not a non-starter for that. It's just like a no-brainer. So anyways, and produced this presentation today behind the scenes. Lori's been at San Juan for 15 plus years. Besides IQ production, she handles all of our oil and gas production, our projects, and finances. So just awesome job, Lori. Thank you very much. And Chris, thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time. Any final thoughts from your amazing conversation?
Now, thank you for holding this, Jerry. I look forward to seeing everyone on June 15, listening to Jason. He will be great and much more local knowledge and perspective than I was able to bring. But June 15 is going to be great. But okay. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Lori. And thank everyone for participating, and onwards and upwards for the San Juan Basin.
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. And we'll be talking to you later. Bye, everyone. And thank you for joining in.